Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who help shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful Midtown Memphis. Now, the website for Memphis Material was designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. Today's interview is the first of two interviews that I did with the great Fredric Koeppel. This interview was done on February 17th, 2024. We don't really have sponsors for episodes, but if we did, this episode would be sponsored by John Hester. John Hester was not only my senior year enriched English professor at Craigmont High School, but was also Fredric's teacher at Fraser High School. And there is a moment in today's interview where my brain melts and I totally lose it for just a little tiny bit because I freak out because Mr. Hester is such a huge, iconic figure for those of us who knew him. And so, for sure, today's episode brought to you by John Hester. Again, this interview with Fredric Koeppel is the first of two interviews. This one was recorded on February 17th, 2024. Enjoy the interview. If it's okay with you, I'm curious, you have so many different connections to art, whether it's through poetry or writing or the visual arts. What's the earliest memory that you have in terms of thinking about art with the big letter A?
When I was growing up, my mother, we lived in Rochester, New York. My mother sort of took over my raising, and my father thought himself responsible for my older brother's sort of upbringing. It's very strange, but that's just... So my mother wrote poetry, and she read poetry, and she read a lot of books. And so she started reading poetry to me when I could barely sit up in her lap. And other books, Winnie the Pooh and Mary Poppins and Dr. Dolittle, things like that. But we looked at art books with big reproductions. We listened to classical music on great big old 78 records. You have to have, to get a symphony, you'd have to have like both sides and stuff like that. So it's fair to say that I was indoctrinated in the arts from the time I was an infant, you see.
Okay, hang on. So one of the things I'm also working on with this project is asking follow-up questions.
Yeah.
So what kind of things was she reading to you? What kind of things were you looking at? What kind of things were you reading?
Oh, well, we had, we looked at big art books of reproductions. So, like some kind of history of art. The Renaissance and Baroque and Impressionism and, modern art and that sort of thing. She read me of mainly, well, she had a certain range of poets that she really loved. Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost. The Imagist poets like Amy Lowell and Sarah Teasdale. Her favorite poet, though, was Edna St. Vincent Millay. She read me tons of Edna St. Vincent Millay. And her own poetry was sort of in that sort of melancholy, broken heart, sort of, kind of thing. Now, my mother was originally from Goshen, Indiana. So she was a small-town girl. And she would have been really shocked if she had known that Edna St. Vincent Millay was like the great, how can I say this? that she smoked and drank and she had sex with everybody. And that, I mean, my mother's just, and I never, when I got to be a grown up, I said, I never told her that. That would have broken her heart. But anyway, so we read a lot of poetry. And then I myself started reading. But when we moved to Memphis, I was 10. This was in 1955, just before I turned 11. And I got my first library card. And I just started with the Greeks and Romans, and I read everything in the library. And then I went on to medieval literature, and I read everything they had. And then I went on to, Shakespeare and the Renaissance, and everything. I just read everything they had in the library.
Now, what do you think it was? It was reading something that you liked to do really early on as a kid, and then what was your library, I guess, like in terms of thinking about the things that you were exposed to really early on with your parents?
I don't think I really had what you would call a library when I was just a little kid. I started accumulating books, though, once I started really reading a lot of books. And I found out where the bookstores were in town, and had my father drive me, can we go to the Blue and Gray bookshop? Oh, yeah, okay, sure. And I'd go and I'd take my allowance money, and I'd buy Madame Bovary or something, or The Catcher in the Rye, and things like that. And my parents never censored what I read. They encouraged me to read anything that I wanted to read. And so that just opened up this whole world for me. In fact, the only time there was an objection was when my father picked up The Catcher in the Rye, and there on the first page was, goddamn. And he was just shocked and outraged because no books that he read, had profanity, of course.
Right. Now, and so thinking about that, when you were saying that you have an older sibling, an older sister, older brother.
Brother.
Okay. Now, what about your older brother? What was he into? What was he interested in?
According to their scheme of raising their two boys, his focus was going to be more scientific. So he, in high school, he went through the whole, 4 years of science and 4 years of math and all that sort of thing. When he was in college, he started taking a lot of psychology, and eventually he went all the way through. He had a master's degree and a PhD, and he ended up as a professor of clinical psychology at what's the school in Hattiesburg, Southern Mississippi. Yeah, he spent like his entire career there.
Wow. Okay. And then was the plan for you to be in the arts in terms of thinking about the written word?
They assumed that I would be a teacher. I'd go to college, I'd get my degrees, and I'd be a college teacher, and that I would also be a writer. In fact, when I was 12 or 13, I was starting to write so much that they bought me a typewriter. It was a big old clunky Royal typewriter that you had to use all your muscle force in order to depress the keys, like that. And I just started writing mainly poems, also some stories and things, but mainly poetry.
Now, what kind of stories?
Very sort of Edgar Allan Poe, Kafka-like weird science fiction-y kind of stuff.
And was that because that was the kind of thing that you were reading?
Well, I was reading, yeah. I mean, in addition to reading, tons of literature, I also read a lot of science fiction.
And what kind of things what do you remember reading in terms of science fiction?
Well, you have to remember this was back in the 50s and 60s, so it was a lot of classic stuff, from the 30s and 40s and 50s. I don't even know. Ray Bradbury, of course. In fact, I went back and I read Martian Chronicles again last year for the first time in about 50 years. And it's still as beautiful as it was, when I was reading it as a teenager or a young adult. So.
And then thinking about poetry, and you read it with your mom. What was it you think that your mom brought to poetry?
Well, what she brought was the sensibility and the love of language and being able to take language and create metaphors that expressed the feeling that was in the poem. And it wasn't long before I really went beyond her. I loved, E.E. Cummings and Dylan Thomas and all the poets you love when you're like 16 and 18 years old. I went heavily into the beat poets and the beat writers. In fact, when I was probably 16, we went to the Rexall drugstore up on Highway 51, and they had a paperback book rack, and there was this paperback, sort of a black cover, and showed some scruffy-looking people on it. It was called The Beats, and it cost like 35 cents or whatever. And I said to my mother, I'd really like to get that book. And she said, yeah, sure, whatever. And I went home, and that night I read the entire book, and it was, William Burroughs and Kerouac and Gregory Corso and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and, all of these people and everything. And so I became sort of a beatnik in a way.
Now, what was it about that book that really drew you in?
Because it was different. It broke all the rules. It encapsulated sort of my sense of rebellion, my sense of not wanting to write safe poetry, little rhyming stuff and everything. My sense of wanting to push out beyond those traditional boundaries and really do something that was like, of course, those were the Eisenhower years and everything. And so it was like, I wanted to be a nonconformist, right? Didn't want to fit in and settle with all these notions of conformity and everything.
So now thinking about that, so you were in Rochester, and then your family moved.
Well, then this is, in Memphis.
And then you moved to Memphis when you were 11.
Yeah.
And what was it that brought them to Memphis? What was it that your parents did?
My father was partially disabled. He had a bad right leg. And the winters in Memphis are brutal. There's snow on the ground for, 4 or 5 months a year. And he just didn't want to have to endure that. So he, in his methodical way, he researched Nashville, Memphis, and Little Rock. I mean, you can draw a line like that. And he decided on Memphis, not knowing anything else about the city, because at the time, in the mid-50s, Memphis was the only of those 3 cities that had a public university. We couldn't afford Vanderbilt. Little Rock didn't have really anything. And so basically we moved to Memphis so he could make sure that my brother and I got college educations that he could afford.
Now, what about your mom? What did your mom occupy her time with? What did she do?
When we lived in New York, in Rochester, she was a proofreader for a legal publishing company. They published, big legal tomes, and I guess she sat there day after day, proofreading. When we moved to Memphis, and we moved out to this little prefab house out in Fraser, she didn't work for a while. She stayed home and managed the house as best she could, because my father was not a steady wage earner by any means. And she made sure that when my brother and I got home from school in the afternoon, there were always chocolate chip cookies or brownies or, Rice Krispie treats or whatever. And she had a real sweet tooth. And it was only later, after my brother and I were both in college and then he went to graduate school, that she got a job. And she was the supervisor of a Head Start daycare center out in Fraser.
Okay, and I know you've told me this before, but where in Fraser was it?
Where in Fraser? We went to Fraser High School, and we could walk there in 10 minutes.
Okay.
And we lived on a street that was originally called Baskin Circle, but it was not a circle, so they changed it to Baskin Street.
Because not around the same time, but I think I was in 8th grade. That was when we moved to Fraser, and that would have been in the early 1980s. And so you were talking about going to the library, getting your library card. Was it that library there in Fraser, or was it the main one?
No, it was the main library.
Okay. Now, what was that like in terms of thinking about going there as a kid and then working your way through the poetry section? What was that like?
Well, it was magical. First of all, it was in that modern building that should never have been torn down.
Right.
And to have this freedom to check out any book I wanted to, even if the librarians at the checkout desk sort of went, your parents know you're checking this book out? And I'd say, they don't care, it's fine, don't worry. It was just this wonderful sense of freedom.
Now, when you would go to the library, would your mom go with?
Oh sure. I wasn't driving yet.
Right.
I was, 12 years old.
Well, Vita, when I had Vita in here, she told me this crazy story about how when she first got to Memphis, she was like 14 or 15 years old, and she was driving around downtown Memphis in her dad's car, and this was how she was this is part of the Vita lore, is that that's how she found the old Art Academy space. Okay, and so thinking about that, where would you read? Would it be there at the house? Would it be in the library?
No, in our house.
Okay.
While my brother and I were in school, we shared a bedroom. We had bunk beds, and then when he got married, I moved into what had been my parents' room, and it was the biggest bedroom. And so I told them, I'm gonna paint and stuff, paint the walls and all. And they said, well, sure, okay. So I went to the hardware store, and I got a bunch of cans of paint, and I painted the walls dark blue and black and gray, and I painted the ceiling gray, and I painted the windows black. It was my beatnik hangout.
Right.
And my parents were sort of appalled. They thought there was something sort of psychologically wrong with me. In fact, for years, my father thought that I had done that because I was mourning the loss of my brother, because we'd shared a room for our whole lives and everything. And I said, are you crazy? It was like this total freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. And he was like, oh gosh, I've been had this illusion all these years.
Now, a lot of the stories that we hear, or that I hear doing this project, is the support or the encouragement of the arts from high school teachers or from art teachers, in school. What was it like for you in terms of thinking about high school and the support or the lack of support you got there?
No, I had, especially in my sophomore and junior and senior years, I had great English teachers. And then I took speech and drama and theater from a man named John Hester, who was...
Wait.
Yeah.
You talking about John Hester?
Yeah.
Wow, he was my teacher too. At Craigmont in 1988.
Wow.
That is so wild.
I mean, he had such a huge influence on my life.
That is fascinating. Okay, so
Yeah.
talk about Mr. Hester.
I mean, he was a young teacher then.
Right,
Obviously,
yeah.
He was a young teacher. It was like he was one of those teachers like you see in the movies or something that just opens up a whole world, And we read plays in class, taking different parts and everything. We went to plays. Memphis had a Shakespeare sort of company or whatever that did a couple of Shakespeare plays every year, and they did them in the old auditorium of the administration building in Memphis State, which is a sweet little auditorium. And we went to all of those, and we went to plays at the Orpheum for traveling companies. And he took us downtown. Front Street Theater had started. It was on Front Street in the basement of the old King Cotton Hotel. And they had a stage that was about the size of this room, and they put on musicals. It was one, and you sat there, and it was to see how lights and props and a set and a group of like 5 people could put on an entire musical and transform everything. It was magical.
Now, can you remember any of the plays that you guys saw?
We saw a lot of Shakespeare, mainly the comedies and the romances, as You Like It, and Much Ado About Nothing, and things like that. I remember at the Orpheum for a traveling company, we saw the Caine Mutiny court-martial with Brian Donlevy as the lead as Captain Queeg. And when it was over, Mr. Hester took us backstage, to meet the star, Brian Donlevy. And we got back there, and he still had his costume on. He was, he had a towel and everything. And we got in right at the end of the conversation, and he said to his assistant or whatever, "Well, you tell that son of a bitch, I'm going to beat his goddamn ass if he doesn't." And we were like, oh my God.
No.
That a star of stage and screen would use language like that. And Mr. Hester got us out of there really fast.
Right. Now, you were talking about going to those plays. I mean, when I put myself in that brain of the high school kid, there were a couple of things that were at play there. One was that I'm not totally sure that I would have been into it, but I do remember that listening to Shakespeare or seeing Shakespeare, of course, is the way it's supposed to be done. And so when I would read it, I would almost have to have like the Cliff Notes next to me. And so I would read a page and then go to Cliff Notes, But when I would see it in real life, like I remember, of course, there's the acting, the physicality of the show, but then there's also sort of the poetry of the language. And even if I didn't get everything, I would still get a good chunk of it. Did that feel, when you were that age and you would go see those shows, was it similar, or were you much more in tune with that because of the reading that you had done?
No, I was much more in tune with it, and I had read a bunch of Shakespeare's plays by myself anyway, right. So I was pretty used to the language and the rhythm of the iambic pentameter and everything, yeah.
Right. And then, and so thinking about Mr. Hester, were there other teachers that were really important as well?
My junior and senior high school teacher in English was Florence Leffler, who later, after she retired, was on the city council for many years, and she was married to a Judge Leffler. Anyway, she was, again, one of those transformative teachers. She was very tough, you know.
Well, it's funny. I remember Mr. Hester. My experience with him is pretty similar. He had such a great enthusiasm and such a great sense of humor and such a good sense that, in part, it was his job to share this information with us, but also it was also a big part of his. You could tell that it was kind of a mission. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm getting paid to do this, but also this, like, I am going to expose you to this if it kills me, sense. And so what was the way that Miss Leffler was present for you?
She was like one of those people that are larger than life, that are like sort of a force of nature. I mean, when you went into her room, her classroom, I mean, it was just like sort of on fire with intelligence and ambition and this desire to learn and everything. And I mean, maybe it wasn't that way for everybody, but it rubbed off on me.
And then thinking about that, what about, for me, when I'm thinking about my high school experience, I definitely remember I was in the class with Mr. Hester, and probably half of the students were in it. They were in the boat with Mr. Hester. What about for you in terms of thinking about Fraser High School? Was there a community of people who were like-minded, or were you kind of alone in this enthusiasm?
I would have to say I was sort of, I had friends and everything, but I was sort of isolated in that. I was one of those pretentious teenage poets who, carried a notebook at all times. And there was, at the old Northgate Shopping Center, there was a little teen gathering place, and I'd sit there at a table with my Coke and with my notebook open, working on poems while everybody else was dancing and everything. So I had a reputation, of being the literary person, the literary kid. In fact, when I was a senior, and the first day of our senior year, and I'd been to Fraser with all these kids, for 4 years and everything. So we were in physics, the first day of the physics class, and I was sitting in a chair in the front row, and the teacher walked in. I don't remember his name. He was sort of a short, pear-shaped guy, and he had a slide rule attached to his belt with a clip. And I stood up and closed the book, and I announced to the class, I will not be taught by a man who wears a slide rule clipped to his belt. And I walked out, and I went down to the office, and I said, I'm dropping physics. And they said, you can't do that. I said, yes, I can. I have enough credits, and I don't need physics. And I want to be a hall monitor. They said, what? I want to be a hall monitor. So that period, which I think was an 11 o'clock period, I sat out at a desk reading and, hassling little kids on whether they had hall passes or not. But, I read Flaubert and Sartre and, all sorts of great literature instead of taking physics.
Now, what about in terms of thinking about high school? Where did you end up going to college?
Memphis State.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was that transition like?
Oh, it wasn't bad because a lot of kids that I went to high school with ended up going to Memphis State. And so we formed sort of a little clique, you know. But then gradually, as you go into different classes and things, you meet other people, and you form circles within circles and things like that, and you get you broaden your own horizons and your friendships and everything.
And so this would have been 1963?
62.
62.
When I graduated from high school.
What was the climate like in terms of thinking about the university there? Because that's like beginning to become the busy time.
They had just integrated, and so there were not a lot of African American students, but there were some. I mean, most of my classes, there was, you know, a black student or two and that sort of thing. You had to take Air Force ROTC. You had to take 2 years in order to graduate. And I was I've been reading a lot of Zen Buddhism, and one of my Bibles was this book called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, that I read over and over and over and over again. And I thought, well, I'm going to be a conscientious objector. So when I was 18 and had to register for the draft, I went downtown, and there was this office in this old building, and this little blue-haired lady was standing behind the counter. And I said, I want to register as a conscientious objector. And she said, well, now, honey, you can do that if you want to. Just go ahead and you fill out these papers, okay? And just make sure and fill out everything. You know, so I filled out this form and all that. And I gave it to her, and she said, now, sweetheart, I'm just going to take this thing, and I'm going to put it way in the back of this filing cabinet, and maybe somebody will find it someday, and maybe they won't. But you just do whatever you want to do. I said, yes, ma'am, you know, whatever. So I went to the commandant of ROTC at Memphis State, who was a real military person, of course. And I said, you know, I mean, I would never be able to do this today. You know, I mean, we are so much braver when we're young than when we get old. And I said, you know, I was not going to take any more ROTC because I was a registered conscientious objector. And he said, well, son, you can register as a conscientious objector, but if you're going to graduate from this university, you have to take 2 semesters of ROTC, and that's just the way it is. So I dropped ROTC and didn't take it. And then in the fall semester of 65, I went back. And I had actually I had a really terrible semester the spring of 1964. So I went back, and the point of all this is that it took me 3 years to get through 2 years of ROTC, and I succeeded. They were always telling me, young man, you know, you need to cut your hair. You need to cut your hair. And I'd always say, sir, I can't. I'm in a rock and roll band. You know, I have to have long hair, you know, for the whole deal, the appearance of it. So anyway.
Now, at the time, what were the things that you were talking about this Zen book? What was it about that book that was particularly impactful for you?
I liked it because it was totally the opposite of Christianity. When we lived in Rochester, we never went to church at all. And so when we got to Memphis, we'd been here maybe like a month or so, and on a Saturday night, my parents surprised me and my brother by saying, make sure you have your good clothes ready. We're going to church tomorrow morning. We were like, what? What are they doing? I think it was more really social than that they were worried about the state of our spiritual beings or anything. Because it was a way to find people and get friends and things like that. So I went to the Methodist church and sang in the choir and went to Sunday school. And until I graduated from high school. Yeah. But the idea that spirituality would be on a plane that did not involve guilt and sin and recrimination and, gods that got crucified and things like that. The idea that spirituality could be surrounded by calmness and observation and a willingness to give up yourself in terms and to begin to become part of the natural world in a way, and also the world of thought and being, plus it was cool, so.
And I imagine that it would fit in with this poetic sensibility in terms of the language and in terms of it's not totally literal, it has this sort of beautiful poetry to it. Mm-hmm. And then what were some of the things that you were reading because when you were talking about the Zen book, you were talking about reading it over and over again. Mm-hmm. Were there other books that became touchstones or things that you would read again and again?
I probably read Catcher in the Rye 20 times.
And what was it about that? Of course it's this cultural touchstone, but what was it in particular about that book?
Because Holden Caulfield didn't fit in, because he felt that he didn't fit in. It wasn't just a matter of not being conformist or anything. It was that he himself knew that he didn't fit in. And, of course, his big mantra is that something is phony.
Right.
Phony. I was really big into that. Always looking out for the phony.
Now, did Salinger speak to you in his other stories, or was it mostly
No, I loved all the other stories.
Yeah.
Loved all the other stories.
Right. And now, were there others?
Yeah, there's a novel by William Gibson called The Temple of Gold, which is also about a teenage rebel. Not nearly as well known, unfortunately, as The Catcher in the Rye, which I read about every 10 years.
Now, one of the things I like about, and I think about a lot when I talk about getting older, is that thing that you were talking about. I think it was a Nancy Cheers review where you were saying that you had seen Nancy Cheers' work for years and years, and that you had seen her grow and change. Mm-hmm. And I love also this idea of going back to books that don't change, but we of course change. And what are the things that you've noticed about Catcher in the Rye as you've read it, as you've gotten older?
Well, younger readers now, Gen Z or whatever, they don't care for The Catcher in the Rye because they say they don't understand Holden Caulfield. To me, Holden Caulfield is like universal. Doubting things, doubting yourself, doubting your parents, doubting everything that's around you, wanting to make things different, not knowing how. To me, that seems like an eternal, an eternal theme. How could you not empathize with that?
Especially thinking about, I think so much of my my being an adult is being pretty in touch with the 18-year-old Hamlet. Like so often when I'm teaching, I'll say, oh, the 18-year-old Hamlet would hate this, or whatever. And I think there's something about The Catcher in the Rye where as often as we read it, we immediately get put back in that place, and then we read it as the 18-year-old or 12-year-old or whatever it was. And now thinking about Salinger and the other stories, what were the other ones that clicked for you?
In terms of like poetry, for example, I was very much into T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound at the time. And so I filled my poems with quotations from the German, the French, which I didn't know, of course, and try to be very, apocalyptical and metaphysical and sophisticated and everything. And that was just a particular phase that I went through.
Now, thinking about college, what were the other classes that were particularly impactful, like as you think about them now?
I took a couple of history courses, Roman history and medieval history from Marcus Orr, he was in a wheelchair. He had been wounded in World War II. Everybody said it was the Battle of the Bulge, but who knew? Anyway, he was one of the most dynamic and demanding teachers I ever had. And he made you think. He made you think for yourself.
Now, what form did that take? Was it through class discussion? Was it through direct questioning?
He lectured and then would read passages from the books that we were, our textbooks. But then he was always asking questions. And if a student didn't know the answer, he would get pretty sarcastic about it.
Right.
And since I had made it my life, my career as a 12 and 13-year-old to read all the Romans and everything, I already had a background in a lot of the stuff that we were reading about. So,
No, you were majoring in...
I made an English major, history minor.
Okay.
And then I took enough art history that it could have been a minor also.
Okay. Now, what was the art history department like? What were the things that you guys were looking at and thinking about?
I took every course that William Christenberry taught. He was there then.
Huh.
And he was a wonderful teacher. Just a wonderful teacher. Especially, he must have made his own slides, because when we did, modern American art, he was showing us slides of Rauschenberg and all this stuff that had only been exhibited like a few months before. He must have made his own slides, but he took us really deep into the art of modern art. Abstract expressionism and as it was leading into, at the time, pop art and minimalism and all that stuff. But he was a very inspiring teacher.
He's such a huge figure. What was the form of his inspiration? Like how was his classroom won?
He was very quiet. He was not emphatic or anything, but he just talked about the art. There would be this, Franz Klein painting on the wall, on the screen, that you were looking at, and he would talk about it in ways that just opened it up, so you could see Okay, that's what Franz Klein did. And that's how he used the brush. And that's how he took his hand and smeared the paint a little bit. And it was like being able to actually watch the artist himself, in a way, you know.
And then, and so, did he talk at all about his work?
No.
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 Was there a place for that? Like, was he showing here? And then, and if so,
he did his first exhibition of the Klansmen in a classroom in the old Jones Hall. Prints, photographs, models, the dolls, and things like that. It was just riveting. I mean, people had never seen anything like this before.
What was the response like?
Among younger people like my fiancée and I mean, we were thrilled. But I think there were even mentions in the newspapers, you know, at the time, that this was improper or something. Yeah.
And then what was the, what about, how you doing? You doing okay? You want to take a break?
I just need to, there we go.
We got these comfy chairs in here. And so, thinking about Christenberry, I mean, of course, and you were talking about how impactful that class was. You know, I, as a teacher, greedily, selfishly want to find out how was it that he opened it up. And because, you know, I'm always looking for ways to talk about that kind of thing with students. And thinking about those abstract expressionists, I mean, they really are, I think, still in 2024 somehow difficult to convey to students the power of those. Can you think of some ways that Christenberry or other teachers at the time were opening those up for you?
Well, his approach was not merely technique, but it was also sort of spiritual and emotional. He didn't limit himself in the possibilities of how you can talk about art. I mean, he tried to approach a piece from every sort of standpoint so that we could understand what was going on.
Now, how old was he at the time?
Young.
Okay. And then, what were the other art history classes like there? What were some other things that you were exposed to?
I didn't take anybody else.
Oh, it was just Christenberry?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so which classes was it that you took from him?
He taught everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how was he different in terms of, because you were talking about like early stuff, like Renaissance things and sort of pre-Renaissance stuff. How was he different in talking about those other things?
No, that's the thing. I mean, he approached all art in the same way, both in terms of technique and in terms of content and meaning and implication.
Right. Were there other artists that you remember being really interesting to you at that time, like in the way that we were talking about Salinger or T.S. Eliot?
Well, he did a lot with Monet and Degas.
Okay. And did those click for you at the time?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely. I think he considered Monet and Degas as being superior to the other impressionists, like, you know, Monet and Pissarro and that sort of thing.
That's interesting. What was it about them?
Because I think Monet and Degas both have a sense of rigor about their work. Trying to think how to say that. There's a sense, to me, of finality about a painting by Monet or Degas, even for Degas, if it's a sketch or a drawing a watercolor or whatever, there's a sense of inevitability to me that takes their work to a different level, just in for me.
Now, thinking about that, with Degas and Manet, are they people that the 2024 Fredric sees in the same way? Or is that...
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, were there people, I mean, of course, I remember a lot of artists that I was not into at the time, and now I'm much more interested in their work, being 2024 Hamlet. Were there people at the time that you remember looking at it and just thinking, "Oh my God, no, not at all"?
Gosh, I don't know really. I mean, Quisenberry was very careful, I think, in terms of what he presented to us. I mean, he saw no need for us to look at, like, academic paintings or anything like that, I mean, he wanted to keep it on the most important, I mean, that seems pretty obvious.
Now, what about in the classroom? Like we were talking before about contemporaries. So in your classroom, were there other people in the class who were just as excited about Quisenberry and what was being presented as you are?
I don't know. I don't have any idea.
Now, was there, I mean, because to me, the thing that I think about in terms of the schools is that there is this kind of hardwired community. There are people that you have classes with over and over again,
yeah.
And so, like, for me, I remember a lot of the people that I would have classes with, and some of them, are still people that I know now. Was that the way it was for you in terms of thinking about English and in terms of thinking about...
We had a group, and as I said, there were sort of circles within circles, and peripheral people and people that were like intimates and things like that, and would sit in the Jones Hall cafeteria smoking cigarettes, and but we were very political, very political. In fact, one time in our, I think our senior year, somebody found an object in a salad in the cafeteria, a safety pin or something. And so my fiancée, Mary Catherine, and I organized a protest and a boycott of the cafeteria. And it was so effective that the TV stations sent out camera crews to interview us and everything. And that gave us a reputation as being radicals, liberals, radicals, communists, whatever. And she took dance. She took a lot of dance. And there were coffee houses around. And most of the religious houses, off campus had little coffee houses. And so we this sounds so stupid now, we would go, I would read poetry, and then I had a little wooden flute, and I'd play my little wooden flute, and she would improvise modern dances. Like,
And so thinking about that, what was the community like in terms of thinking about poetry? Were there other, I mean, obviously there was this one aspect of going to the coffee houses and doing the readings and the performances. What was the community like in terms of other poets?
Well, I was, for a couple of years, I worked on the literary magazine, The Phoenix. So I was involved with a lot of young men and women who were writing poetry and stories and things like that.
Now, was there a lot of overlap between the arts, the visual arts community, and the dance community, and the music community?
Yeah.
Were there overlaps? And if so, what form did they take?
Not so much in music, but certainly in dance and theater, and in the English department, that sort of thing. There was a lot of overlap.
Now, you were going to school with these three different interests. In your mind, what were you thinking the world would hold for you after school?
Oh well, I would go to graduate school, and I would get an MA and a PhD, and I would get a fine job at a fine university, and I would publish a lot of poetry and short stories, and by 28, I would be a famous writer.
Right. That's so funny because when I talk to my students about the path that we were described or that was described for us, it was super similar. And one of the things I do a lot with my students is I talk about how in that path, no one says anything about kids, no one says anything about parents with cancer, no one says anything at all about like cars breaking down, there's none of that, or girlfriends getting pregnant. No one talks about any of these things, and when I'm talking to my students, so much of it is like, well, there's this way over here, and there's another way over there, and another way over there. And thinking about that for you, what were some of the things that you began to realize as you were done with school?
You mean after?
Yeah, when you were done with college.
Oh, wow. Well, you probably know that after Memphis State, I went to the University of Iowa. Mm-hmm. I was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and a Graduate College Fellow.
Now, did you just go straight?
Yeah.
Okay, so there was no time in between?
No.
Okay,
Mm-mm.
Okay. And then, so at that time, just to sort of like put us in the chronology of the world, that would have been mid-1960s?
Yes. 66 to 69. I was there for 3 years.
Okay. And then, well, let's talk about Iowa City then.
Oh, Iowa City was great.
Mm-hmm.
Cafes and bookstores, and, people were always marching about something and protesting something, especially the Vietnam War.
Right. And then what was that? Was that something that you were particularly active with?
Yeah.
Okay. And then what form did that take? Like, how would you, like in my brain, I think about the civil rights and the anti-Vietnam era, and I just sort of see this image of people in the street marching, but I know there's a lot more to it. And so what form did that take in terms of day-to-day life?
I was never, how can I say this? I was sort of lonely in graduate school. I did not, part of graduate school, of course, is making friends and being chums with your professors and accumulating moxie and reputation and everything. And I didn't do any of that for various psychological and emotional reasons. So I was not like an organizer or anything, mm-hmm. but anytime there was a march or a sign carrying or whatever, I always did that.
Okay. And then what was the curriculum like in terms of your studies?
My major was English and American literature, 19th and 20th century.
Okay.
So the concentration was in those areas, but you were always required to take other courses. I remember I took a course in Samuel Johnson,
mm-hmm.
Which falls outside of, my chosen field, but it was just part of what you did.
And to me, one of the things that's really interesting about grad school is there's this kind of like continual narrowing and like a continual realignment of a kind of focus for the things that you're studying. And then thinking about that, what were some things that led you down that particular path?
I'm I'm not sure what the question is actually.
Gotcha. So I remember one of the things that would happen a lot when I was in Rome. I would talk to people and they would say, "Oh, I study this one particular aspect of Italian literature." And then I would say, "Well, how did you find yourself in that place?" And sometimes it would be they were in a particular program that would have a particular area of focus. Sometimes it would be a particular teacher and that was their area of study, and then through them they would get turned on to another aspect, or they would follow a particular poet. Sometimes it was just because nobody else was studying this person, and so I'm the only person who knows about this one poet, or I'm the only person who knows about this one particular donkey in this one particular villa. And so I guess one of the things I'm thinking about is, out of all of the things to study, how did you find yourself in that particular area of the...
Because that's really what I like the most. And when I was teaching English, that's what I also liked to teach the most, 19th and 20th century. Because the world changed so much, and there were so many transitions and sort of repercussions and things, and to see how all that manifested itself in poetry and fiction,
Right,
was really what I was interested in.
Okay. And so it's almost like this overlap. I mean, obviously thinking about history as you were studying history, and then also thinking about literature and how those things are obviously connected and overlapped. I mean, it seems like one of the things that was also really powerful and impactful for you was seeing the different ways that those things were connected. And so thinking about that, when you were studying the things that you were studying in those particular literature classes, aside from the, let me see what I'm thinking here, aside from the tremendous change that you were seeing in there, was there something in particular about the language that was interesting to you?
Yeah, I would say so, because the transition from the Victorian era to the modern era involved a complete reorienting of how people thought about language and poetry.
Okay. Now give me an example of somebody where you would see that.
Oh, well, I mean, if you read, Robert Browning or Tennyson or Swinburne, and the language is still very sort of poetic and sort of flamboyant and that sort of thing. And then you get to the Imagists and then Ezra Pound, and they've pared away everything, and poetry becomes declarative. This. You see, and that required a great sort of shedding of all the 19th century poetic traditions, and even to the point of writing about things that nobody thought about writing before. I mean, the war had a lot to do with that.
Right.
World War I had a lot to do with that.
And then thinking about that, you mentioned teaching. What was it about teaching that was appealing to you?
Of course, I didn't know what it was going to be like. I had no idea. I had never been a teacher.
Right.
I was because I had fellowships. I'd never been a TA or anything. So basically, I burned out of graduate school. I just burned out, flamed out. I called the chairman of the English department of the state and said, we're moving back to Memphis, and do you have an instructor's job open? And he said, yeah, actually we do. So, we moved back to Memphis, which was traumatic in some ways because basically, I was a failure. And I got a job because I didn't have anything to do that summer. And I got a job as a sawyer in an overhead door company down in South Memphis.
Okay.
And I was doing that. And he called me, the chairman of the department called me and said, we have a night course summer school opening up. You want to take it? And I said, yeah, you bet. So my first course, it was like 5 to 8 o'clock or something, And so I was, and we lived near campus, so I was walking to Patterson Hall, the English building. And it started to rain. And I took my red bandana and I tied it around my head and took off my shoes and I walked in there and there was the class. And they were like, who is this? What's happening? And I put my shoes on the floor and I, took my bandana and wiped my face off. And I said, hi, I'm Ricky Koeppel and I'm going to be your teacher. And I think today I'm going to read some poetry to you. And I did. I had a book of Robert Bly in my backpack. And I took it and I read poetry to them. So that was my first teaching experience.
Now, one of the things that totally blows my mind about college and teaching is that I'm a college teacher and I've never had any kind of pedagogy training. I've never had any kind of curricular training.
Most people don't.
And so what was that like for you in terms of going in and being the guy that was going to read some poetry to him today?
Well then, of course, you have a textbook, you have a syllabus, you have certain things that have to be taught and that they need to know by the time they get to the end of that semester. So there are ways in which you have to conform to certain standards and protocol, and that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that you can't slip in some poetry or whatever when you want to.
Right. Now, what kind of things, one of the things that I love about teaching is that it's basically a complicated form or a simple form of show and tell. It's basically me saying, look at this. Oh my God, I love this. Let's talk about this, And so what were some things that you were particularly interested in? You talked about bringing in the Robert Bly. Mm-hmm. What were some other things that you were particularly excited about and particularly interested in to share with them?
I liked the whole range of English literature. You start with Beowulf and Chaucer and Shakespeare and, John Donne and Milton, et cetera, et cetera. I love teaching Shakespeare because you get to read a lot, I love teaching John Keats. Some parts of English literature you have to just get through.
Right.
Nobody's going to go home and read Alexander Pope just for the fun of it.
Right.
But that's just part of what you expose them to. Probably 90% of the students just want to get out of the class, get the work done, whatever. But you always find, you see it the first day. You walk into class, you check the roll, everything, and you look at the students and all, and you think, okay, that's a smart person. Okay, that's a person who's really interested. That's a person who's really going to try hard. And generally it works out that way,
And so you had those pieces or those people that you wanted to share with them. And then what about the rest of teaching? Did that sort of come naturally, or was that more difficult, like the grading and the bureaucracy?
Grading, yeah. I mean, that's always a pain. I taught both semesters of freshman and sophomore English and creative writing.
Okay.
Yeah. Creative writing was, a little freer, of course. Sophomore English, where they really have to take their writing seriously, that can be hard because a lot of the students didn't really want to take it seriously. They didn't care about writing a term paper, doing research and doing footnotes and things like that. When I was an undergraduate at Memphis State and had a research paper due the next day, I wouldn't even start it until 9 o'clock at night. And then I'd have like 10 books spread out like this, all open to the pages that I needed to look at, and note cards, and I just write that paper right there.
Now, something about that surprises me, Fredric. I mean, when you think about how passionate you were about reading, from a very early age, and how passionate you were about it, it almost seems like study. What was it about the writing that was so difficult when it was time to do those papers?
No, that's the point. It wasn't difficult.
I see. So it was something that kind of came easy to you, and you were just sort of a procrastinator.
Yeah.
Okay, I gotcha. It's funny, one of the podcasts that I listen to a lot is this one called Long Form, where they talk to people who write long form essays, like for Vanity Fair or for The Atlantic, where it's like, installed over several different things. And every episode, to a single episode, every episode they'll say, okay, now what about the writing process? And they'll say, oh, I hate it. I hate it. And I love doing the research. I love being in the field. I love meeting the people. I love taking the notes. I love finding out about what's going on behind the scenes. But when it comes time to like sit down and actually hammer out this essay or hammer out this long form piece, it's just dreadful. It's just painful. What about for you when it was time for you to do those essays or to write those papers? What was that process like for you?
It was almost it's pretty intuitive, automatic. I would have an idea, and I would bolster that idea with quotations from scholars, et cetera, et cetera. And I would know what I was doing in my head. It was all there. And
Right.
I'd just sit down and write the thing.
Now, what about the poetry?
Well, poetry's different, of course. Poetry comes from a place of words. To me, a poem is about language. All right, and it's about presenting the reader with a point of consciousness that's embodied in the language of the poem.
Okay.
I don't think that poems are meant to be inspirational. I don't think that poems are meant to be, a source of comfort or calmness or any of that. I would much rather read a poem that is unsettling and disturbing, a poem that takes language to a place that I had never sort of thought about that before. You see. You see, on the internet all the time, oh, I love Mary Oliver, or I love this poet, or I love that poet, because, I always turn to them when I'm having a hard time, and they always help me through. And I'm just like, that's bullshit. I don't care about any of that.
Now, thinking about that, though, for me, I love that moment where you sort of inhaled and you changed gears from the creative writing or from the literature, and you moved into the poetry, and you started talking about what you felt like it was for.
Sure.
And this thing that you talked about, or that was for me sort of under that, is thinking about how poetry for me puts me in the head of another person in ways that I think literature doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something about,
Sure.
not just in terms of the things that they notice, but also in terms of the way that they put things together, but also in terms of thinking about some longer poems, the way a story is built in a way that's not like you would normally find in, say, literature, you know, that operates maybe more chronologically and then more linearly. And were there poets, are there still poets for you that are like that? Like you were saying, more unsettling?
I still like the poets that I really read a lot of in the 60s and 70s, like W.S. Merwin and Mark Strand, Robert Bly.
Now, what was it about Bly? You mentioned him a couple of times.
Yeah, because I mean, I will confess that I don't look at him with such a sense of, fondness as I did back then. But he had this sort of Zen approach of the point of view of the writer becomes the point of view of the reader, in the sense of getting inside a thing, an object, a blade of grass, a mouse or whatever. There's just this sort of fascinating combination of the personal and the impersonal.
Now, one thing that you said, too, is that you were thinking about how, or you were talking about how oftentimes when people will talk about their work as being a kind of, or poetry being a kind of comfort, like Mary Oliver or whoever. Like, for me, one of the things, too, that poetry does is that it will say things using language, but that has been in my head in a kind of nonverbal way for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then I'll come across a passage or I'll come across an entire poem that somehow encapsulates that. And for me, it's this really wonderful way, not just like, oh, thank God, somebody put it into language, because this has been a thought that's been floating mm-hmm. around in my head for a long mm-hmm. time. But it's also this really, for me, a really beautiful point of connection with this person that I've never met, and maybe separated by great distance or maybe great time, but there's this wonderful point of connection with another person that's somehow thinking the same thing that I was thinking in the same way that I was thinking it, and so for me, I'm not sure if it's like if it's a comfort so much as it is maybe a validation, and then also like this sense that what I'm thinking isn't totally bonkers, and that it's also like a real thing. You know what I'm saying? And is that something that happens with you as well?
I don't think so. Sorry.
So Hamlet is a weirdo. Great, Fredric. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That's okay, Fredric.
Yeah.
I'll make it.
I mean, you read poetry differently according to its time and place. Mm. You don't read a 17th century, Jacobean poet the same way you read Ezra Pound.
Right.
Or the same way you read, Merwin or Robert Bly. Mm. Because ideas about poetry change, I mean, they don't progress. There is no such thing as progress of the arts. The arts are just different mm-hmm. according to their time and their place, and all the influences and everything. So when I read Keats and Coleridge, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and I read them frequently, I read them in a different way than I would read like Sylvia Plath or Robert Lowell. Even when their poems are, talking about Coleridge and Keats, even when their poems are personal, still they are writing within a poetic tradition that to a certain extent dictates how they write. You see, of course, what do? They go beyond that, as any great poet does. So, reading poetry today, like really contemporary poetry, I occasionally feel left behind a little bit, because there are different kinds of sensibilities at work. But at the same time, with my whole life of, background in reading poetry and everything, I can recognize that a poem is good or not. Because, there are those things. There are good poems. There are bad poems. That book you gave me to read, that Floaters, wow. That's just an incredible book. Just an incredible book. Very moving, and yet at the same time filled with wordplay and moments of language that are puzzling or delightful or mystifying or whatever it is. So I keep saying I think I bring to the reading of poetry like that, a whole lifetime of reading poetry, even though, I might finish that book and, go pick up, some 17th century poet or something. And I realize, of course, that basically poets are trying to do the same thing, whenever they are writing and whatever the context happens to be.
Now, one of the things that I think about when I think about you is I think about this love of food and the love of sort of all things taste, whether it's food or whether it's wine. Where does that come from? Is that something that was there really early on as well?
No, not at all. My poor mother was a terrible cook. She was the sort of classic 50s and 60s home cook for whom when frozen vegetables started to be available,
right,
that was like so much better than canned vegetables. Like, wow, what a revolution. That's really interesting. My ex-wife was a good cook. I like to eat out, certainly, but there's a sense in which reviewing food or reviewing a restaurant is not all that different from reviewing a play or a movie or a book. There's intentionality, there's craft, there's talent, there is the finality, the success. It's just that the contexts are, totally different. And of course, with food, it is deeply personal. Deeply personal. I liked, for a while there, before John Bifus became the movie writer, people in the arts and entertainment or the features section took turns reviewing movies, and I loved doing that. The playbook editor would say on Friday, like at maybe noon or 11 o'clock, he'd say, who wants to review a movie for tomorrow? And I always said, yeah. And so you would drive out to the suburbs to a movie theater for a 2 o'clock or a 2:30 showing or whatever, watch the movie, jump in your car, race back to the newspaper, writing that review in your head the whole time, hit the computer, while the editor's standing over you, saying, come on, I need this by 5 o'clock. That taught me so much about writing on deadline and how to condense what I was thinking and what I wanted to say into real, believable, pithy, little sentences and paragraphs. I mean, when I went to the newspaper, I had no journalistic experience.
Now, we shot ahead to the newspaper.
We sure
which
did.
Is totally
we
okay
sure
with
did.
me.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I don't mind, but just to back up a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
What took you there?
What took me?
To the newspaper.
Oh, okay. Wine. My first wife and I were living in Senatobia, Mississippi, teaching at the junior college. Wine is one of those aspirational products. To know about wine is to have a little bit of social cachet. To know how to order a wine in a restaurant brings a kind of aura of acceptability by your waiter or the wine steward or whatever. Knowing how to pair wine with your dinner, as a mark of sophistication.
But now, how did you get this? Was this something that was present when you were a kid?
My parents were teetotalers.
Okay.
They never drank. They never had to drink alcohol. But I started, experimenting with alcohol when I was in high school and in college and all that. And basically, we drank what everybody else drank at the time. Hardy Burgundy and jug wines and, Chianti in little straw, baskets and all that stuff. And in the late 70s, I said to my wife, because I had started reading a little bit about wine.
Okay.
And so I said, why don't we get 2 bottles of wine every week of something that we have never tried before and don't know anything about? And she said, okay, that's a good idea. So, Senatobia is in a dry county, so I had to go to Memphis, to buy the wines.
Okay.
We did that, and I got a notebook, and I started teaching myself how to make notes about wine. And at the time, when I finished the wine, I would always steam off the label and put it in the notebook, so I had the record. And we did that for all of 1983, and I still have that notebook. And in 1984, while this was continuing, I thought, the commercial appeal needs a local wine column, something that pertains to this area. So I wrote up a couple columns, and I went in, and the feature editor at the time was Mary Alice Quinn, and I introduced myself and said, I had this idea. And she said, well, let me take a look, okay? I said, sure, fine. She, I'll get back to you. And so she sent them to Big John Guzani so he could read them and basically say, does this guy know anything? Does he know what he's talking about or whatever? And he said, yeah, actually, that's pretty good. So she called me and said, we want to run your column once a month. I said, that's great. So they did that for 2 weeks. This was July and August of 1984. And then she called me and she said, can you do this every other week? I was like, whoa, okay, sure. And that lasted for 2 months. And she called me and she said, we want to run it every week. It's incredibly popular. It's become the most popular column in the Commercial Appeal.
Now, to me, one of the things that's really interesting about that, and it's a conversation that I have with a lot of people, is the language that's used to describe the nuances of wine is, I think, as particular and as not specialized, but is connected to a very particular realm as art. And so you were saying that you started to read about wine and you started to think about that. What was the way that you were able to verbalize the flavors and able to verbalize this, experience that's just as strange as dancing about architecture? And so how do you figure that out? Or how did the 1984 Fredric figure that out?
That was a matter of instinct and the reading that I had been doing. I mean, most wine writing, even if it occurs in America, is sort of Eurocentric, right? Because that's where wine basically originated, and the idea that people would want to write about wine originated and everything. So it happened that way, but at the same time, as a writer of poetry and fiction, I thought that I had the freedom to inject a little more individuality into the notices about the wines, and to be a little outrageous sometimes, to be metaphorical sometimes. And, I've been criticized for that, but that's just the way I've been doing it for 40 years.
And so talk to me a little bit about then the food. I mean, that seems like almost like a logical extension of the wine. There's this language that goes along with wine, and then that seems like that would be pretty applicable to food. P.S., you doing okay? You want to take a break?
It's cold in here.
It is cold in here.
Yeah, I'm sort of shivering.
I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a change that we can make.
Yeah.
I don't see a little thing. Well, if you want, we can just go for like 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Whatever. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Here's how that happened.
Okay.
I came to the newspaper full time in August of 1986.
Okay.
The feature editor had called me and said, "We have a job open in features, and we would like you to apply for it." I was like, wow, what a change that would be. So at the age of I was in my early 40s, all of a sudden, bam, I made this leap into a whole other way of life. So my purview was writing feature stories and the wine column. And at the time, the newspaper used to send a reporter and a photographer to the country selected by Memphis in May for a month.
Oh my gosh.
And so the country coming up was People's Republic of China. And I thought, wow, okay. So I did up, a plan and what I really want to accomplish and that sort of thing. And they selected me to go. Now, I had only been at the newspaper for like 6 months, so there was a lot of resentment about that. So anyway, my photographer and I, we spent a month in People's Republic of China, and came back, and so I was writing like crazy, writing. I wrote enough stories that they ran a story on China every day in the month of May. Nobody had ever done it before. So anyway, in that April, we're still in 1987, one day in the department, John Sparks, who was the feature editor, handed me a card, like an invitation to a show. It was to the senior exhibition at Rose College, graduating seniors. And he said, do this. I said, what, you want like an advance or something? He said, go review it. You're the new art writer. Bam, just like that. Now, we already had an art writer, and I sort of went, what up? And John said, he's out. So that's how I became the art writer. And then for the food, the following January, you keeping up?
Yeah.
The same John Sparks, the woman who was the restaurant reviewer came in one morning. She had all her stuff in her arms. She dropped all her stuff on her desk and said, that's it, no more. I'm finished with reviewing restaurants. And John Sparks stood up at his desk and went, like the scout looking on the horizon. And I went, I just raised my hand.
Now, why did the person decide to leave? Like, had she gotten a lot of hate mail, or
No,
was she just fed up?
She was just tired of all the food and all the desserts. And in fact, she said that. She said, no more creme brulee. That's it. That's how so many of what I developed at the Commercial Appeal that really became big deals for me happened totally accidentally.
I like that. One of the things I talk a lot about when I do my talk is luck, and how much luck played a part in how it is that I'm where I'm at. Okay, Fredric, that sounds good. Let's pause there. And that was the first of 2 interviews that I did with Fredric Koeppel. That interview was recorded on February 17th, 2024. Please join us next week when we will have the second of 2 interviews that I did with Fredric Koeppel. Until then, thank you for listening.